Why do philosophers love death?
It's a good question as to why philosophers love death. And it's essentially because it's a main orientation point for meaning. Because faced with ultimate loss, it then asks you, well, what is important while you're alive? And so facing death, facing finitude or your own mortality then becomes a central sort of way to frame, what is a good life? And I think certainly a lot of people are curious about that.
What does it mean to have a good death?
It's a good question about what it means to have a good death. It's been a fascination of a lot of philosophers of, well, it's to be, surrounded by people, and it's to be, have a legacy, and I think a lot of cynics have also. There's a book about all of the ridiculous ways that people have died, and so I think that largely has become more of a sort of joke within philosophy of that there's all this obsession about having a good death, and ultimately, what does it amount to, and what does it really matter? Why does it really matter? I forget who it was, but there was a general who was really trying to have this, good death, and he was bleeding out, and he was trying to get all of his men to come together before he passed, and they weren't coming together fast enough, and he knew he was going to die, and he just blurted, "Tell them I said something great," and then died. And so I think stories like that seem to have kind of taken the main, that it's like, well, let's talk about life itself rather than, what it is to die, because you really have no control over it.
If someone has a story idea and they never write that story, does their story idea even matter?
It's a good question. If somebody has a story idea, I would say this means seem harsh, but I would say it doesn't matter. I think ultimately what's real is what you put into the world. But even if you just write it down, right? Like Emily Dickinson, she had hundreds of thousands of poems that never were published, but once she passed, people found them. And then those were out into the world, and those took on, and a whole kind of world of meaning was built around her and what she created. And so I really am a strong advocate of always, putting things down and taking action and, and creating, because if it's just in your head, then it's not yet in the world. And so I always try to get as much out as possible.
Is that something that plagued you? Because it sounds like you've always had these ideas or been drawn to things that were maybe ahead of your time?
I think for me, there was a sense early on of what it is to be great and to have a legacy, and certainly to sort of like establish yourself and sort of beget success from that. And so, but I think as far as kind of linking with ideas ahead of my time, or I think it was more, always came from within, is like, what is it that I want to say? And I want these paths to open up further for me, so that there's less inhibitions, that I can write down an idea and then go to investors and get a project going and just kind of move. Because there's never a shortage of ideas for the next film, and there's probably 15 projects that I've got brewing at different stages, and so it's more been about sort of how to converge that momentum in order to be out there more in the world and expressing and working with people that I love to work with.
When you were studying philosophy at UC Berkeley, was that your goal then, to go into directing and producing films, or did you not know exactly what you wanted to do?
I always knew I was a storyteller, and that was, my path and my life, and specifically studying philosophy at Berkeley was to understand the power of story. and I loved horror films, and so I kind of asked, like, well, is that what I'm going to do? Is just make horror films while climate change and all these other things are happening? And it was philosophy that sort of regrounded the value and kind of went back to the very basic questions of faced with these problems, what can one do? And sort of allowed me to sort of rebuild my sort of world of meaning and sort of get more concrete on values and to better understand the power of story. And that was, through existentialists and, read a bunch of Dostoevsky and Kierkegaard and then I came back and I was like, okay, I feel like now I'm not wading in the water, that there's a solid infrastructure around me that I can build future projects and build my career on top of.
Why not go to film school and just, learn how to write the next, fun teen comedy?
I started making films really in like elementary school, and then so by the time I was in college, by the time I was in high school, I'd already been taking film classes at college, learned screenwriting and production and just kind of basic things. And I was enormously self-taught. So every documentary about filmmaking, every behind the scenes I could get my hand on, commentaries. And so then when it turned to going to film school, I felt like it was doubling up. And I also took umbrage that the schools sometimes own your films. And I thought, why am I going to pay a massive amount of tuition to also pay to make my own films if I feel like I already have that knowledge? And it felt like it was doubling up. So I thought, how can I sort of extend my knowledge of filmmaking and storytelling? And that led me to philosophy.
What differentiates a movie that has a great message, a good message, from a movie that's too preachy?
A film that's too preachy, I think, can be too just heavy-handed on an audience, and essentially your immediate reaction is like, well, it feels more like a rhetorical argument. It feels like you're at dinner and somebody's saying, like, you should believe this. Whereas a film that I think just has a message is, for me, kind of like interacting with somebody at dinner, and they're saying, like, well, these are the things that are important to me, and this is the way I see the world, and this is the way I think one might consider a situation like this, versus do this, be that, and so that in my films, while they do have messages, I'm always very conscious of not having it be too heavy-handed.
How does a movie effectively present a point without insulting the intelligence of the audience?
I mean, in any film, as a director, you're always asking yourself, okay, this is what I'm showing visually, and what is the audience going to take away from that? And I always try to assume that the audience is smarter than I am, and not kind of hand feed them things. Certainly, there's parts where if you need to connect dots, but I always assume that people will be smart enough to get things, and if they aren't, then they'll ask the person next to them in the theater. And I do really think it's important to not speak down to your audience or to be too kind of heavy-handed in storytelling, because it can easily lead to an eye roll, which then pulls people out. And I would rather people be asking and engaging and sort of drawing people further in together about, hey, can you clarify this? Can you clarify that? Rather than saying, well, I feel like I'm, in a film that's for kindergartners or something like that.
Sure. So it may be better to leave with a sense of mystery, where there's like people can't exactly figure out. There's an ambiguity to it.
Yeah. So I watched a ton of Sidney Lumet's voice. So I watched a ton of Sidney Lumet's commentaries. He actually has a commentary for every single film he's ever made. And one point that comes up over and over and over is the cutaway. Is say you have somebody who really wants to be invited to a party, and they get an invitation and they open it. Do you cut away to the invitation? Or do you say the audience is smart enough, they know that he opens the envelope and he's been invited? And so that level of distinction, and I'm on the same camp, is that you don't have to spoon feed every bit of information. The audience is very smart and will be with you. And so then you can move on to the next scene where he's actually at the party, because we get the point, right?
Can you explain how stacking the deck in favor of a message is cheating the audience? And how stacking the deck against your message is challenging the audience and ultimately hitting deeper truths?
So in constructing a film that ultimately has a message and you're wanting to, I feel like if you're wanting to sort of lead the witness, or in philosophical terms, like use a straw man argument, that it is pretty disingenuous, because essentially, we all know why leading the witness is not a great idea. But I think in filmmaking, you can run into a similar concern, where if you want to show somebody something, there's so many ways to do that. There's so many brilliant films that do that. But if you're wanting the film to draw a conclusion, then for me, it sometimes just feels like a bit disingenuous, a bit like a rhetorical argument, rather than having a conversation. It feels, again, like, being a bit condescending to the audience, that you can kind of trick them into thinking this or that. And I just feel like it's in bad faith. And so in constructing narratives, I'm always sensitive to that point as well. That you're not manipulating, and that you're not doing anything further than saying, consider this and see this and step into this other world.
Has that happened where you have footage, you have a rough cut on the editing timeline, and you realize, oh no, this is a rhetorical question, and we've got to go in and fix it, or is that something that they're cognizant of when you're shooting, and it doesn't normally happen?
Generally, it's in the way the film is structured or framed in the beginning, but it certainly can come out in nuanced decisions as we're working through. In our film 7 Days in Syria, for example, we were conscious that we're really showing one side, and that was because we didn't have access to the other side. And so, we put little bits and pieces in the film itself to acknowledge that, and just kind of cue to the audience that, like, you're seeing this perspective, you're not seeing the perspective from the other side. And that was just, again, to sort of, give proper context to an educated audience about how to interpret and watch this film.
Because essentially it was a story of a female journalist who wanted to go over there and was told, don't do it.
Yeah, but essentially we also were on the Free Syrian Army side, so it was mainly the rebel army that was, going against this, very dictatorial regime. The troubling statistic was that 80% of Syria at the time was in favor of this dictatorial regime, which is, just killing people left and right who are opposing them. And so, but that wasn't our full perspective. We were to sort of walk you into a window into this other world and what it's like to live during wartime.
And I believe some of the footage was from other people's cell phones, and you gave credit to them?
Yeah, exactly. So we pulled, basically when we were in Aleppo, there were different people that we met along the way, and then we incorporated their footage as well. Other journalists, other people that were just civilians, and used that to kind of build a more holistic picture of what life in Aleppo before it had fallen was like.
And did anybody say anything about they felt it was one-sided or not?
Certainly there's some comments online, and not with my film, but basically pro-Russian, pro-Syrian. People have tried to hack accounts for their film and tried to disparage it in all these different ways, because eventually essentially what you're there is you're showing what it's like to be a human being, and those who are trying to oppress those human beings are usually, at least in these cases, backed by governments and have their own budgets, and they sometimes do that to try and censor.